Welcome to the HBOT News Network. I'm so pleased to have Dr. Peter Canaday here from New Zealand. And so we are blessed to have Dr. Canaday with us today, who's had a wealth of experience, has been involved in the medical industry for, Dr. Canaday, is that nearly 35 years, or where are you?
Well, we're on to 40 if you count the time after I finished my training in pulmonary medicine in 81, so we're on to 41 now.
So pulmonary training, and so
Yeah.
so perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about your background so our audience understands where your experience is.
Yeah, well, I finished medical school at the University of Massachusetts in 1976 and then trained at the University of Michigan in internal medicine, which is the field dealing with generally diseases often treated with medications as opposed to surgery. Then I spent 2 more years at the University of North Carolina, not far away from where we are today, and did training in pulmonary and critical care medicine, finishing in 1981. After that, then I joined a small practice of pulmonary and critical care medicine at a large trauma hospital in West Denver, where I practiced then for 12 years. And we'll get to what I started doing in the early 80s, which is very topical for today's discussion. So after that, I had a change of interest and became trained in radiology, spent 4 more years of training at the University of Wisconsin from 1993 until 1997. And then after completing that, spent a few more years in the locums environment where I would just substitute radiologists for a while, weeks or 2 at a time. And then in 1999, joined the Faculty of Medicine in Radiology at the Creighton University Medical School in Omaha, Nebraska. So that's where I stayed for 8 years, became tenured, did some research and teaching of a particularly influential star student named Ted Fogarty, Dr. Ted Fogarty, who has probably appeared on this program several times, but he's has now become a friend and a colleague in this new realm, old realm to me, but new realm in a way for me as well. So since finishing in 97, rather in 2000 and in 97, and then in Creighton at 2007, I had several other short-term assignments in Denver, first of all, and then in Sioux City, Iowa, where I was a radiologist there, and then found an interesting opportunity in New Zealand back in 2009. So a friend that I had met at an earlier conference invited me to come back to cover for just 5 weeks in June of 2009. So that's what I did. I packed up all of my certificates, took them to Wellington to the medical council to show them I was actually not counterfeiting my credentials, and spent 5 weeks in New Zealand at that time. I came back in 2012 after a few more locums assignments elsewhere in the Midwest, and then started a employed position in New Zealand in 2013, and had been there for essentially 8 years until retirement just this last April of 21. So we've lived primarily in New Zealand. We come back to the U.S. Historically, we have. Before COVID, we came back every summer to do some locums work in Wisconsin.
You had mentioned, I know you touched on this earlier, and I know that you had some hyperbaric oxygen therapy experience back in the 80s. Perhaps you could share that with us, if you could.
Yeah, I guess it's a bit unclear as to how I started to get interested in that, but the whole concept of oxygen and pressure vessels and all that had been fascinating to me for some time anyway. And then to discover that there was actually extensive therapeutic use for this in medicine, aside from the diving industry and all of that we knew about, was really fascinating to me. And so I was able to enroll in and take a course in hyperbaric oxygen therapy, which was taught by one of the pillars of hyperbaric medicine, Dr. Eric Kindwall, in St. Luke's Hospital in Milwaukee. So I attended that course along with a colleague of mine at my hospital, which was named St. Anthony Hospital Central at that time in West Denver. And so we both were at this course and were very engaged in attempting to start a hyperbaric medicine department, which eventually we did both co-found. At the time, he was an advocate for monoplace chamber therapy because it was more simple, I suppose you could say, would be more adaptable for a small hospital, even a larger hospital. And I was an advocate for multiplace because of its therapeutic flexibilities and things that we could do in at least a larger volume of patients, which I anticipated we would be able to develop. In any case, the hospital administration was persuaded to go the monoplace route, and we installed 2 Secrets chambers in a department. We recruited nurses and treated a number of individuals for the indications which were approved for reimbursement by Medicare and the insurers at that time. Now, of course, everyone knows about carbon monoxide poisoning and the dive injuries, but there's not too much diving going on in Denver, Colorado at high altitude. But there was an interest and actually a lot of patients who had chronic non-healing wounds. Excuse me. A lot of patients who had chronic non-healing wounds or, for example, chronic osteomyelitis, the occasional osteonecrosis that we saw. And these formed the bread and butter of the therapeutic regimes that we carried on at that time. This was all sort of classical protocols that we were using, established by the Undersea Medical Society primarily, and use of the higher pressures we look at 2.4 ATA, for example, and for 90-minute sessions and 30 to 40 sessions, much of which we see as the sort of the backbone of therapy today, I think. So that was, it had a following, and certainly the surgeons understood that there really was some benefit to this when they dealt with some of their non-healing wounds. So there was something to keep it going for that length of time. So this was from the early 80s through probably the end of the 80s, and that was close to the point where I was turning my interest more towards radiology and the training that I did at Wisconsin beginning in '93. But that department at that hospital still exists today, and it is actually staffed largely by the vascular surgeons and some others who have interest in this field.
So I'm curious, from the standpoint of, you seem to me by your career that you're a curious person, and you moved into different areas, along the way, from pulmonology to radiology, teaching, and then over to New Zealand. And so your curiosity in light of hyperbaric oxygen being used for wound care, and as you mentioned earlier, carbon monoxide poisoning or the bends, the diving accidents, did you see sort of a gap of things that were somewhere in between there that might have benefited from you? Did you ever have a mind's eye on that and say, well, maybe this could be used for other stuff as well?
Well, we were certainly aware of the so-called unapproved indications, which even back then had included things like, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, PTSD. PTSD wasn't quite as developed a concept back then. It certainly existed. We had all those Vietnam War veterans who probably were, out in the the outer reaches and not really being probably managed quite well. But there wasn't, to my recollection, there wasn't really much study that was being done on that, or that had been published, or that had been gotten to the point where it had been approved. We knew about that, something about that study that came in later years that you would know about, and perhaps can correct me, but there was a study by the military in regard to the effect of hyperbaric oxygen on PTSD, and they had used as their so-called sham treatment, or their so-called placebo, they had used a 1.3 ATA session and compared that with the full oxygenation at 2.4 ATA and all of that. And it found very little difference, and therefore had not wished to go ahead with the funding for that indication. So the more recent and very exciting research that's come along now, especially that which has now been put forth by Dr. Harch in some of the work that my colleague and friend Ted Fogarty has done, has shown that actually it may be that there's benefit even at these lower levels of pressurization, even to the point where pressurization alone may have certain significant effects. And as Dr. Harch's article has indicated, there is a recruitment of the anti-inflammatory enzymes and a suppression of the pro-inflammatory enzymes that can be achieved through even these lower pressure units. And so we're beginning to see now the potential mechanism for which hyperbaric therapy, whether with or without oxygen, may be effective. In the past, we've been a bit low on the number of studies that have actually shown this, or even on the physiologic basis of it. But now those studies are being done, and that's what makes this field so exciting in today's day and age.
One of the areas that you had shared with me earlier, as we have just met, is some of the work that you're doing in New Zealand, and one of the things that Dr. Harch brought up, and some of the other doctors we've interviewed, is the issue that we're dealing with today, where there are some residual side effects from people that have suffered from this COVID-19, as well as, and even in the unvaccinated, as well as these vaccine injuries for people that have both had COVID, had the vaccine, and had COVID repeatedly after that as well. And I know that it's been highly politicized, that the science has been wholly ignored, and I know that you were in the midst of that, and so there's a podcast that you've done in New Zealand. So could you share us a little bit of your experience with that, and in fact give us some information so that our listeners can find your podcast?
Yeah, well, I think you're talking about the general concept in which scientific inquiry has been suppressed, and things which represent conclusions that we can make from peer-reviewed literature are simply ignored or set aside without discussion, and in fact even censored. And unfortunately, I and a number of my colleagues in New Zealand have been at the receiving end of some of this censorship. So this is on a bit of a different topic, but the concept is the same, and that is suppression of scientific literature and scientific inquiry, and effectively the suppression of scientific debate. Because all science advances through the capacity to debate ideas, to evaluate them, to discuss them among people of levels of expertise.
Perhaps it's no different with hyperbaric oxygen, as it's been suppressed for 100 years.
Absolutely, and that's why, I guess maybe the same character, whether fortunate or unfortunate, the character that has gotten me into hot water in New Zealand, that is the curiosity and why can't I investigate this? Why am I not allowed to see this? That same sort of character has, gotten me in a bit of hot water there in New Zealand. So what happened is that after I retired from radiology in April of 2021, I began to see more and more about what was coming out regarding the COVID vaccinations and so-called vaccinations, and I was really concerned that there was too much of a rapid rollout of a very brand new technique, which had previously been known to be a genetic modification technique, now being rebranded as a vaccination, and that there were inadequate clinical trials, that there was a rush to release this vaccine, that there was suppression of what turned out to be very effective not over the counter, but at least repurposed existing drugs that were not allowed to be used, despite the evidence that had been shown in other countries for their effectiveness as a treatment for this COVID-19. So anyway, there were a number of things that appeared to me by reading the actual scientific literature, or in fact, maybe reports about the scientific literature, and then going into the original papers, and seeing that this was actually supported, that there were real reasons to be concerned about, this rollout of this inoculation product. So I'd gone on a speaking tour to 16 venues throughout the North Island of New Zealand and one place in the South Island, and gave a public speaking presentation for about an hour and a half, just going through the very beginning of what is a vaccine and why do we use it and how is it made typically and why is this one different and what are the effects and what are the clinical trials supposed to usually look like and how is it different this time, and and what have been recorded as the adverse effects, and why is that not being noted as a signal for so many of these injuries that we see now with this vaccine compared to all the ones that we've seen in the past. And all of these kinds of topics were the basis for my presentation. So I had done that in person for these various venues throughout New Zealand, and then we were about to do the largest one in Auckland, which is our largest city, on the 17th of August, and then on the 19th of August. And on the 17th, the Prime Minister closed down the country, effectively shut it down, and said there will be no public meetings of large numbers of people. So, we would have had some, 500 or 600 people, I suppose, but that just was off the table. So we went online and did a webinar for this presentation, sponsored by an organization called Voices for Freedom. And Voices for Freedom was a grassroots organization that had started in December of 20 by 3 young ladies from Auckland area who were just concerned about the way that this whole process was being rolled out by the New Zealand government. We were presented with a Prime Minister who's on video clip telling us that you will look to the New Zealand government as your single source of truth regarding the vaccinations. That did not sit well with a number of people, especially those of us who've had a scientific background, and we know that you have to debate things. We know that you have to talk not just about benefits, but you have to talk about risks. We also have to talk about informed consent. And informed consent is a bedrock principle for all practicing physicians, and that was, we felt, not being really dealt with in a proper way. So I did that, and then...
Well, I'm curious with the webinar, did you have many people log on and watch? Did they give you the numbers? Or?
There were, for that particular webinar, there were maybe 1,000 or 800, something like that.
Is it accessible? So is it online?
Yes, and I'll provide that here as I describe what happened next, because there's a bit more to the story too. Is that after that happened, I was asked, or in any way got involved in a series of continuing webinars every 2 weeks, beginning in September of 21 or 20 rather. No, it would have been 21, and then. So I did a 1 hour or so, 1.5 hour webinar every 2 weeks in which I would give updates on the latest medical literature, scientific studies that bore on this very problem. What was going on in other countries, what the scientific literature had shown, the epidemiological studies that had shown, what are the actual effects of wearing a mask or having vaccinated people versus non-vaccinated people, all those sort of things that we now know quite a bit more about. But this was a way of trying to reach out to a certain segment of the New Zealand public that were, tuning in to these webinars because they were seeking some alternative viewpoint, and it really was not being offered from, the government standpoint. So anyway, that is all available and is now on an Odyssey channel. Odyssey, I think you may know, is actually one of the alternative video channels to YouTube, and it's just odyssee.com. And if you look there under Voices for Freedom, Odyssey, and then search under Voices for Freedom, you'll find a whole lot of videos, much more than mine alone. It's a wonderful repository of interviews with the luminaries in the field of this COVID vaccination and the people who are trying to get the true science out. So my segment under there is just, you can search under the search bar and look under the surname Canaday, Canaday, and that'll bring up all of the previous work that I had done in that, for Voices for Freedom, and that's available for anyone to see.